We now have a reconstructed argument, or we at least understand what the steps are in reconstructing the argument. Now let's take a look at how you go about evaluating the argument. Let's consider the following argument. Drugs should be legal. After all, those who use drugs only harm themselves. Good argument? Well, first thing we want to do is we want to reconstruct the argument. Well, what's the conclusion? Drugs should be legal. What's the premise? Drugs only hurt those who use them, therefore drugs should be legal. So now we have the argument. Now, let's consider the following. If somebody were going to criticize this argument, I know when you guys first saw this, you've decided, oh, this was the most ridiculous argument you ever heard. And let's think of why. And I think there are two ways that a critic of this position, this argument, will criticize the argument. And the first one might say is, wait a second, there's no connection between drugs not only hurting those who use them and being legal. That is, they say the conclusion, some people will think, that a critic would think the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. And that is, the question is, what is the connections between drugs only hurting them, the people who use them, and drugs should be legal? Somebody will say this is a bad argument because that conclusion does not follow logically from the premise, excuse me. But there's another way, and that we say, if that's our criticism, maybe you think it does, maybe you think it doesn't. Let's just assume now that it doesn't. We say that an argument where the conclusion doesn't follow logically from the premises is invalid. So that's one kind of criticism you can have of an argument. That is, that the conclusion doesn't follow, it's invalid. Or flipping it the other way, if that's a good part of the argument, you would say the argument is valid. In this class, valid can only be used, or invalid, for the connection between premises and conclusions. Valid in English has a much wider use, but in the realm of philosophy, when we're talking about it, valid becomes a technical term in logic, referring to the connection between, the logical connection between premise and a conclusion. And the second way somebody might go about criticizing this argument is by saying, wait a second, that premise isn't a reliable or an acceptable premise. The premise is just false. Drugs don't only hurt the people who use them. The people who take drugs steal. There are all kinds of other. They hurt people who are friendly with them. And in this case, we're going to say that our criticism is, that the argument, does not have a good basis. That is, it's based on a false or unreliable premise. So in this case, we would say the argument's unsound. But unsound arguments, either of these two kinds of problems make an argument unsound. But the bottom line in our evaluation of this argument is that this argument fails on both counts. And let me just assert that these are the only two kinds of criticisms that you can make of an argument that make any sense whatsoever.